Hello, Dr. de Zayas. Thank you for being with us today. You have worked as a UN Special Rapporteur on the crisis in Venezuela. You have been able to lead an investigation in Venezuela. So, what could you tell us about the current crisis and especially the most recent developments, like the power cuts especially?
Well, the crisis, as I indicated in my report to the Human Rights Council, has multiple causes. Surely the trigger for the crisis was the dramatic drop in oil prices. A country that depends 90-95% on its sale of oil and gold, etc. If prices go down, that actually bites. But what has really aggravated it, what has made it from a manageable economic crisis to a much greater crisis that some want to refer to as a humanitarian crisis, that is a hyperbole. It's not Gaza, it's not Syria or Yemen or Somalia or Sudan or Mali. It's Venezuela, and there's scarcity of some food items, of some medicines. But what has really caused this crisis is the economic war. I mean, there's a major economic war, internal and external. Internal in the form of sabotage. We've just seen the problem with the electricity blackout. You know, it's the same blueprint as in Chile. I just read an article in the New York Times, 14 August 1973, 4 weeks before the putsch of General Pinochet against Salvador Allende. They did exactly the same thing. They had a major blackout in Chile, as they had a major blackout now in Venezuela. Now the cyber terror is very well known. And the U.S. is quite proficient at it. The U.S. has done it repeatedly against installations in Iran, also against centrifuges in the peaceful nuclear energy sector. So the allegations of Maduro that the cyber attack came from the United States, of course using Venezuelan operatives, that is believable. I'm waiting for the evidence, though. I'm waiting for proof. But it's not always that easy to establish the proof. As the case may be, there is a financial blockade that has made it nearly impossible for Venezuela to buy foods and to buy medicines and dialysis equipment and scanners and all sorts of things that Venezuela needs in the medical sector and of course in all sectors of daily life. Now, what is peculiar is the ocean of lies that we're being served, or that we're being doused in day after day by CNN and Fox and New York Times and Washington Post and Wall Street Journal, etc. Anyone who has been on the ground, anybody who's been in Venezuela realizes that the media is lying. It's not only manipulating evidence and suppressing evidence, it's actually outright lying. And it's shocking, because you would think New York Times, with its motto, all the news that's fit to print, would, for instance, mention the existence of my report to the Human Rights Council. Never. The New York Times doesn't mention my report. The New York Times does not accept an op-ed from me. The New York Times has never invited me for an interview. They invite all sorts of Venezuelans and other people to speak, but me, I don't exist. Same thing goes for CNN, same thing goes for the BBC. So we are dealing with a rather Orwellian situation of peace is war and war is peace and love is hate. It's a corruption of language that we are witnessing. You probably know Alice in Wonderland. and that wonderful scene between Alice and Humpty Dumpty, where Humpty Dumpty is so prim and so happy with himself that says, you know, Alice, I make words mean anything I want them to mean. And Alice says, but you can't do that. You know, words do have a meaning. I said, no. I mean, the question is, who has the power? Who is master? And if I do it and get away with it, tant mieux, so much the better. And that is what we are witnessing. Human rights have been weaponized. Human rights are not only an entitlement, not only an expression of fraternity, of international solidarity, an expression of human dignity. No. Human rights is being used, including by Amnesty International and by Human Rights Watch and by numerous other non-governmental organizations, as a weapon to destabilize. The idea is you demonize Saddam Hussein, you demonize Gaddafi, you demonize Maduro, and that makes it palatable then to march in to do a so-called humanitarian intervention, which of course is not humanitarian, it is military and causes total chaos, leaves Iraq devastated, leaves Libya devastated, and that's what they would like to do with Venezuela. They don't care whether they devastate the country as long as they get hold of the natural resources. Venezuela, everybody knows, is the first oil reserves in the world. And it may be the second in gold and in bauxite and in coltan, etc. It's a super rich country. But of course, right now, it cannot sell its oil, its gold, its bauxite, etc. It does sell some, of course. It sells to India, it sells to China, etc., etc. But it is under siege. As I said, this reminds me of the medieval sieges of towns. That, of course, was intended to have a town surrender. You starve them, and then they surrender. Now, modern sanctions regimes are intended to bring a whole country down, not just a town. The idea is to force regime change, but it's not working. I mean, the idea was in the minds of Pompeo and Bolton and Alfred Abrams, is that if you make the life of the Venezuelans difficult, they're going to turn against Maduro. They're going to go on the streets and demand that he resign. They're going to become violent, and they're going to rush the palace of Miraflores, etc., etc. That is what Bolton and Pompeo and Abrams thought was going to happen. Same thing on the 23rd of February, when they had their Trojan horses in Cucuta, in Colombia, and they wanted to bring in so-called humanitarian aid into Venezuela. Now, it's déjà vu. It's a repetition of a bad screenplay, of a bad movie. We saw it in Nicaragua with the Contras, and we saw it in the Dominican Republic, that U.S. aid was used to bring in weapons and contraband to the opposition. Now, I'm not saying that these trucks contain only contraband. I'm just saying that with food and medicines, very likely there was contraband. And if the United States meant well, all they had to do is to give the humanitarian aid to the United Nations or to the International Committee of the Red Cross, and then they would have transported them into Venezuela, and they would have taken responsibility for the distribution. And obviously they could have seen whether there were any weapons or things that did not belong in the trucks. So it was basically a big show, but the mainstream media played the game. The mainstream media promptly blamed Maduro for the classical false flag. Now we have videos that prove that it was the opposition that burnt the trucks, but all the press, without any confirmation, without any evidence, accused Maduro. How is it possible that this monster would destroy food and medicines so direly needed by the population of Venezuela? What kind of a man is that? So that was the narrative that we read in the New York Times, in the Washington Post, in the Wall Street Journal, etc. That's what I said. We are swimming in an ocean of lies and in an ocean of manipulation, because what's at stake is public opinion. You have to manufacture consent in the public so that the public accepts that the United States will come in and bring democracy to Venezuela. Now, yesterday began a one-week exploratory meeting of a team from the Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights. They are in the process of preparing a visit by Michelle Bachelet. Michelle was invited by President Maduro to come to Venezuela and to see for herself what the situation is. And Maduro has asked advisory services and technical assistance, something which the Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights does routinely. So I'm sure that yesterday and today and tomorrow they will be visiting hospitals and they will be visiting all sorts of installations. I wouldn't be surprised if they invite the team to visit the hydroelectric plant that was sabotaged. There again, we've been so much lied to by the press over the last weeks and months that I suspect that even the team of the Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights suffers from misconceptions that it will take them a while to overcome. When I went to Venezuela in November 2017, I had read all the reports of Human Rights Watch, of Amnesty International, of the Inter-American Commission on Human Rights, of Zeid Ra'ad al-Hussein, the former High Commissioner. I had really informed myself enormously on the conditions in Venezuela. When I went there, I realized that it was not like that. And I was rather shocked, because I had expected more professionalism from the Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights. I mean, I was a senior lawyer for the Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights for many years. I was secretary of the Human Rights Committee. I was head of the Petitions Department. And I can tell you that the Human Rights Committee, of which I was secretary, never would the Human Rights Committee or the Secretariat servicing the committee simply suppress information. Non-governmental organizations like Fundalatin, like Grupo Sures, like the Red Nacional de Derechos Humanos, gave personally to Zeid Ra'ad al-Hussein an enormous amount of documentation, statistics, photos, videos. For instance, on the violence, on the terror of the opposition guarimbas. Because people seem to forget, we're dealing here with paramilitaries. We're dealing here with an extreme right that wants to take power by force and try to boycott and make impossible and terrorize the population into not voting in the referendum, or rather the vote they had for the constituyente, for the constitutive assembly that they established in 2017. Well, millions of Venezuelans did go to the polls in spite of the violence, in spite of the terror from the extreme right. And all of this was documented. They even burnt alive 7 poor Venezuelans, mostly black, because if you're black in Venezuela, they assume you're a Chavista, you assume that you are with Maduro. So don't be anywhere close to a guarimba if you're black or poor, because you will be targeted. I mean, these things were so horrendous, you wouldn't think that this would happen. But it did. And this information was given to the High Commissioner, was given to the Venezuela desk at the Office of the High Commissioner, and of course was also sent to Amnesty International and to Human Rights Watch, etc. It's just been blended out, like it doesn't exist. You read the 2 reports of Zayas on Venezuela, and there's nothing on the enormous level of violence by the opposition. There's nothing, no criticism of the unconstitutional nature of the actions of the National Assembly. Because why is the National Assembly held in contempt of court? Why was it declared en desacato by the Supreme Court of Venezuela? Well, it went way beyond its mandate. The National Assembly was trying to do what the National Assembly or the Parliament in Brazil did, to carry out a parliamentary coup. It's not in its faculties, it's not in its competence to remove the president. I mean, they just tried by every possible means, and that was called, it's an operation that was called La Salida, exit. And that was carried out by the National Assembly. On top of it, there were 3 delegates who had been proven that their elections were fraudulent. So the Supreme Court, that was seized of the matter, said, look, we've got a problem here. You have to rerun those elections. And I think the National Assembly